Okay, so just picking right back up where we left off last class, talking about empathy and the difference between empathy and sympathy. So if you guys remember, empathy is a more complex version of sympathy. So sympathy is like feeling sorry for somebody, whereas empathy is being able to put yourself in their shoes and really experience the emotion as that person experienced the emotion. So you might experience joy with them, you might experience sadness, whatever that might be, you actually are able to experience that emotion with them. And we had just kind of started talking about the empathy altruism hypothesis. And what this is an explanation for why people help other people. Okay. And when we look at conditions and in context of what are the situations where people help other people, this can help with that sort of explanation. So Daniel Batson is a sociologist who was a really strong proponent of the idea that people can help purely out of the goodness of their hearts. And so one thing that he acknowledged was that people sometimes do help for selfish reasons. So for example, to relieve distress of seeing somebody else in pain or suffering. We talked about that last class. But he also argues that people's motives are sometimes purely altruistic, and their only goal is to actually help the person, even if it comes at a cost to them, whether it's physical danger or an actual financial cost. And so this empathy altruism hypothesis is kind of using this idea that you really have to feel some sort of empathy when you are in a situation where you are helping somebody for altruistic reasons. So if you feel empathy for a person, the chances are you're going to help them, and you're going to do so even if it result in no gain from you. And so I've got a nice kind of drawing to kind of show how this particular empathy altruism theory works. Okay. So the idea is that if you don't feel empathy, then you have to think about, we talked about that social exchange theory, right? So what are the costs and benefits? That's where it starts to come into play. So if you don't experience empathy for someone who is in need, now you start doing that ratio in your head. What am I going to gain from this? What is this going to cost me? Whereas if you do feel empathy, that social exchange theory doesn't really come into play, because you want to help them because you understand what they're feeling. So here's an example. So here we observe somebody who is in need of help. The question is do you feel empathy for this person? If you do, then you're going to help no matter what. You're going to help even if the costs outweigh the reward. It doesn't matter if anybody's observing you. It doesn't matter if anybody's watching you. You're going to help in this particular situation because you feel empathy toward that person. If you see somebody in need and you do not feel empathy for them, what will happen is that this social exchange theory comes into play. What are you going to gain from it? What are you going to lose from helping? So you might help out in this situation if it's in your best self-interest. So for example, if you see somebody observing you, you might help that person because you want them to think that you're a good person, right? You might help that person because you think later on, I'll make a Facebook post about how helpful and nice I was to this person in need, right? So these are definitely things to consider when you're still engaging in the helping behavior, but your motive has changed. So instead of, doing so for, to help the person just because that's like, you want to help them. Instead, you're doing it for some kind of self-interest, self-gain, whatever that might be. If you don't profit from the helping, chances are you might not help. That's only if you don't feel empathy for that person. They've tried to recreate this in an experimental way. And so this sort of scenario is that there's a student named Carol, and Carol needs help with her introductory to psychology class. And so she needs notes, she needs work that she's missed because she had to miss class. So they had two groups of people essentially, and they asked people if they felt empathetic toward Carol, because we've all had situations come up, right? Family emergencies. We had situations where we've had to miss class for whatever reason. And if you were to say, well, I really feel empathetic towards Carol's needs. I've been in her shoes. I understand and feel that overwhelming, anxiety of missing class. So those people who said, yes, I feel empathetic toward Carol, were actually much more likely to agree to help her. Okay, so here you can see that a person who has high empathy, okay, these are the people who are agreeing to help Carol, okay? If they have high empathy, and also they're going to see her later in class, meaning that they're going to see her again, they were much more likely to help her, okay? So if they felt empathetic and they knew that they were going to encounter her again, they were the most likely to help. If a person felt very little empathy, they were not going to ever see her again. Okay. These were the groups that were least likely to help Carol. Okay. So this would be an example where you don't feel any empathy. You're like, well, she should have, gotten notes from somebody, or that's just too bad. We're all trying to, go along our way, and whatever, it is what it is. So if you have very little empathy toward her and you're never going to see her again, chances are you're going to not help her. Okay. But if you are going to see Carol again, even if you don't have empathy, you would be more likely to help her because you are going to feel bad, right? If you see her struggling, you're not empathetic toward her, but you're going to see her in class over and over again, you're probably going to help her because you're going to feel guilty later on if you don't help her. And also maybe it looks good to the other students that you're offering your notes and you're helping her study. Okay. Those people who have high empathy, and even if they never see Carol again, they're going to be more likely to help because they're empathetic toward her. So even if they never see her again, they're going to be more likely to help. It's this scenario right here. This person right here helps regardless if it's in their self-interest. They have empathy toward the person. This person might say, I'll never see this person on the side of the street again, but I'm going to help them because I'm empathetic toward them. So when you have high empathy, regardless or not, if you're going to see that person ever again, you're going to be more likely to help. Just to recap. So this is stuff that we've already talked about. This is stuff that we have already gone over. Okay. There's three basic motives underlying prosocial behavior. The first one we talked about was evolutionary psychology. Okay. And that is that we help because it helps to pass on genes. Think about the kin selection idea that comes from that. The second motive is social exchange theory. This is that ratio of maximizing rewards and minimizing costs. Why are we helping? Why do we have relationships with people? Well, there's something to gain from it. And does that outweigh what we have to lose? Okay, so that social exchange theory kind of plays onto those factors. And then the third one is one that we just talked about, which is the empathy-altruism hypothesis, which means that if you have compassion and empathy towards somebody, that is going to result a lot more often into selfless giving. If you do not have empathy towards somebody, chances are you're only going to help if it's in your best self-interest, right? Now, each of these approaches has its supporters, has its critics. We've talked about each one of these and how they not necessarily are mutually exclusive, that we can kind of look at them as approaches and motives together. So for example, if a person doesn't have empathy towards somebody, so using that empathy altruism hypothesis, if they don't have empathy, chances are they're using the social exchange theory to decide if they're going to help or not. So just because there are three basic motives doesn't necessarily mean that we have to take one approach and we forget the other two. Okay, so they're used sort of integrated together. Now, another explanation for why people help is that maybe there's some kind of personality trait that is associated with helping behavior. And so psychologists, especially those who are interested in personality, and remember, they're different from social psychologists because they're interested in those individual traits which make us unique, whereas social psychologists are more interested in the context and how we use those traits, right? When we're around other people. So when it comes to the altruistic personality, there is some evidence that there are traits that are associated with more helping type behaviors. Okay. However, we know, we talked about this time and time again, that personality does not determine behavior alone, right? So personality alone does not determine behavior. And social psychologists are constantly arguing that in order to understand human behavior, we need to understand and consider the pressures of the situation in addition to the person's personality. So the context of the situation matters. It's not just the person's personality traits, right? Predicting how helpful people can be is no exception to this. So even though we see people that do have qualities that can cause an individual to help others in a pretty wide variety of situations, when we look at studies of children and adults who help, we find that even if you score really high in a personality test of altruism, that doesn't actually predict the likelihood of you helping. And so they're not more likely to help than somebody who scores lower on an altruistic personality test. So just looking at personality alone is not enough to predict if somebody's actually going to engage in helping behavior. And what we find is that because individual differences in personality are not the only predictors, we have to look at other things like situational pressures. Are people around you? Maybe you don't, you're not the type of person that has those altruistic traits and you're not likely to help on a personality test, but you're in a situation where you see other people helping and you feel like your image is going to be harmed, then you're going to jump into that situation and be more likely to help. So even though your personality traits don't reflect and wouldn't predict you helping, you being in a particular situation with certain situational pressures might actually indicate if you're going to help or not. Gender is also important. We're going to talk about that in a minute. Culture is important, and how your current mood is. People who are in good moods tend to help more often than people who aren't in good moods. So you might have personality traits that make you more likely to help others, but you're in a terrible mood and you're like, you know what, I'm just not in it. I'm not feeling this today. And you actually might not engage in helping, even though you have all the traits that point to you being an altruistic person. There are a lot of other factors that play into determining if you're going to help or not. So let's look at gender. So I want you guys to think about these two different scenarios, okay? So in one situation, we have a person performing a very dramatic, heroic act, like the example that I gave earlier, last class, about storming the cockpit of that United Flight 93 to take control of the plane and to stop the terrorists from crashing the plane into somewhere else, right? This is like a very dramatic, one-time heroic act. Now, when you think in this other scenario where a person is involved in a long-time helping relationship, for example, helping with a disabled neighbor, helping with chores around the house, helping somebody for maybe months to even years. So what I want you guys to think about, do you think there's a gender difference in the likelihood of one gender helping compared to the other? So do you think that men or women are more likely to do the first scenario, or do you think men or women are more likely to do the second scenario? Number one, men, because it could be due to risky behavior. Number two, somebody said men tend to do one heroic act while women are long-term domestic caregivers, I think, and women. So you guys are on the right track. So it turns out, even when you look at lots of different cultures, okay, we find that very likely, because of the way that men and women are socialized very early on, that it does predict the likelihood of these two scenarios, who is actually helping in which case. So in Western cultures, the male sex role is, being things like chivalrous, right? Chivalrous and heroic. If we look at how girls are socialized, that girls tend to be socialized to be nurturing, caring, and to value close long-term relationships. So just knowing that a lot of times when we see people being socialized a certain way, we see that actually reflected in these kinds of helping behaviors. So in that scenario one, where you're, performing one kind of dramatic heroic act, that tends to be men. Men tend to be, engaging in those kinds of prosocial behaviors, whereas women tend to be the long-term helping relationships, caregiving relationships. If we look at the Carnegie Hero Fund Commission, which awards medals for people who save a stranger, 91% of those have been men. Okay. When you look at engaging in volunteer work, when you look at, helping, being caregivers, now we're starting to see that women tend to perform in the second scenario with these kind of long-term helping behaviors. And when we look at cross-cultural evidence, we see a lot of the same pattern. There was a study where it looked at 7 different countries and found, just like we find in Western cultures in the US, that girls tend to do more volunteer work in their communities compared to boys. And so again, is this a universal thing, or is this something that is socialized, or is this something that tends to be culturally specific? When we're finding that a lot of cultures are socializing genders the same way, it's really hard to distinguish what's universal in our genetics and what is actually socially driven. So something like that is really, really difficult to be able to tease apart in this case. So just like I was saying before, men tend to perform the chivalrous, heroic acts. Women tend to be more likely to be caregivers. So let's look at cultural differences. So we got gender differences down. There are some gender differences. So when we look at how people decide if they're going to help or not, okay, we know that looking at different cultures, that if you identify somebody as part of your in-group, so this is a person that you identify with as being a member of that group. So for example, your in-group can be anything. Your in-group can be all people your age who are going to college. Your in-group could be your gender. Your in-group can be your culture, maybe Appalachian culture. Your in-group can be your religion, and even more specifically, what denomination religion. So you might say, well, that in-group of, let's say, Christianity is, I look at any member, any person who says that they're a Christian, I think that they're a part of my in-group. Or maybe it gets even more specific and says, well, yeah, I mean, Christianity is my in-group, but more specifically, Baptist is, that's my super in-group, right? So, I mean, those are things that those are groups of people that you identify with. And then you have out groups, right? So maybe this is a group that you don't really identify with. It's not that you don't like this group. It's just that you don't identify with them because you're not in that culture. So let's say you are Baptist, but, and you know somebody who's Jewish, and you don't feel like you guys belong in the same group. Or maybe there's a person who is from the North, right? So somebody who's from like Massachusetts, and you feel like, well, I don't really connect with that person because they have a different sort of culture than I do. Maybe it's that, you don't identify with somebody who is of an Asian culture because there's different things there, right? And so these are just people that not necessarily you have anything against them or you dislike them. It's just that they're just a different group from you. You might even include, like, for example, people who are 70 years and older, right? So you might say, well, I don't really talk a lot of people with a lot of older people. And I don't really feel super comfortable because I just feel like we're very different. It's not that you dislike people who are older. It's just that you don't consider them as part of your in-group. Now, what's interesting, and I had you guys take these assessments early on to identify if you have an independent view of yourself or an interdependent view of yourself. So if you guys remember, the independent view of the self is more likely to be kind of, I don't want to use the word like selfish, but it's more inward thinking about oneself. It's a more independent view. You are more likely, and again, this can be an age thing. This can also be something that is cultural as well, because we talked about like Southern culture versus kind of Northern culture versus Western culture in the US. This is kind of just focusing more on yourself. Okay. And, you guys are at that age where you are focusing on yourself because that's kind of the expectation for our culture, right? We expect college students to be finding your way and, trying to see what your identity is. So, our culture pushes a more independent view for, the ages between maybe like 17 and 25. That's kind of what our culture pushes. Now, a more interdependent view is one that's more group oriented. And so what we find is that a person who has more of an independent view, okay, the question is, are they more or less likely to help somebody, right? And so we might predict that a person with an interdependent view of themselves has a greater sense of connectedness to others. And we would think that a person who has an interdependent view of themselves may be more likely to help because they feel this connectedness with others. But again, there's a lot of factors there that can predict the likelihood of helping, but just these are some of those additional factors. What do you guys think when it comes to in-group versus out-group helping? Do you think that you're going to be more likely to help somebody to whom you connect to? Or do you think that you're going to be more likely to help somebody who's part of your out-group who you don't feel as connected to? You're in-group, absolutely. Absolutely. So it turns out that if you are more likely to, if you are looking at somebody who's in your in-group, chances are you're going to help them when you feel empathetic toward them. And you're going to be more likely to feel empathy because you connect with that person and you have more things in common with your in-group, even though if you actually look at your out-group, there's a lot of commonalities there, but most people are biased and they don't see the commonality. So when we look at people, people have a lot of individual differences, but we tend to be a whole lot more alike than we realize. And when it comes to somebody in our out group, usually what we're doing is we're if it helps our self-interest, if it furthers our own self-interest, if it's beneficial and there's a lower cost, that's usually more predictive of us helping somebody in our out group. Okay, so in our in-group, we're going to help when we feel empathy. In our out-group, we're more likely to help because it makes us feel good about ourselves or it makes a good impression on other people. I want you guys to think about this. So let's say you found a $20 bill on the ground and you could do one of two things with it. You could spend it on yourself. So you could like buy yourself lunch, or you could spend it on someone else. This is definitely something that is situational and it depends on like how you're doing financially. So I got one person saying they would spend it on someone else. And it's okay. I mean, I would probably, if I found $20, I'd be like, woo, I'm getting myself lunch. So a lot of people are saying spend it on someone else. What's interesting here is that we have some social things happening here. We want to give this socially acceptable answer, right? So for somebody to say myself, you have to be comfortable with this group and not feel like, you're going to look like a selfish person, right? So again, whether or not you actually spend it on someone else, that's a situational factor. So there's a lot of people saying, so there's one particular one is probably on myself unless you see someone in need, right? So if you're by yourself and you're like, oh, I could spend this on my friend, but I don't know where my friend is, I'm just gonna spend it on myself, or you don't see anybody else who needs it, yeah, then you might just spend it on yourself. So what's interesting is that mood comes into play here. And it turns out that if you find $20 on the ground and you're like, what should I do with this? And you're not in the best mood, in order to improve your mood, you can actually spend it on a friend and that's going to kind of lift your mood up. What's also really interesting is that when you are in a situation where you find something like money right? That can actually put you in a good mood. And when you're in a good mood, you're more likely to help somebody. So why is it, do you think, that if you are in a better mood, that would predict you being more likely to help somebody? So they actually did this study where they had people find a coin, they left coins out, and then they had somebody walk by and drop all their papers. And it turns out that 84% of the people who found the coin before this person dropped their papers, because it was a controlled study, 84% of the people helped the man pick his papers up. And only 4% of those people who did not find coins actually helped. So when you're in a good mood, you're going to be more likely to help. But why do you think that is? You want to help somebody else be in a better mood or have an even better day? Absolutely. It turns out that when you're in a good mood, you tend to look on the brighter side of things, right? And you also, kind of similar here, to even have you want somebody to have a better day, but also you can prolong your good mood by helping somebody. And it also increases our self-attention, and it makes us kind of think more about ourselves in relation to other people. So like, for example, you might see somebody drop all their papers, and if you're in a bad mood, you're like, ugh, that guy's such a klutz, he's just gonna have to clean his own mess up. Whereas if you're in a better mood, you might have more sympathy for the person, and you might want to give them the benefit of the doubt. Oh no, that sucks. Let me help you. When you see somebody that's a victim, for example, of like, they fall down or they hurt themselves or whatever, when you're in a good mood, you tend to see the better side in people, and you want that, you tend to want to have others feel that bad as well. It also turns out that when you're feeling guilty, you're more likely to help. So like, for example, if you're Catholic and you go and you do your confessions, you're going to be more likely to help after confessing, just because you feel guilty. And that also can, and it helps you improve your mood. It also helps reduce the guilt. And that's that whole dissonant feeling, right? You just want to improve your how you're feeling. Another determinant if you help or not is where you're at currently. If you're in a rural area, kind of like, rural Appalachia, where there's not a lot of people around and your houses are really spread out, versus a really urban area. And that would be like, for example, if you're living in a bigger city, that actually can predict the likelihood if you would help somebody, if you are currently in a more rural area or if you're in a more urban area. So there's some really interesting things. We're going to get to that in just a second here. Also, residential mobility factors in. So how often do you move from place to place? And how connected do you feel to the community will predict the likelihood of you helping. And then finally, we're going to talk about bystanders and the bystander effect, and how the number of bystanders can impact the likelihood of you helping or not, with more bystanders reducing the chance of you actually engaging in help, because you're looking at everybody else saying, well, somebody's calling 911 or somebody else is going to help. So we'll talk about that here in a minute. We'll go through each one of these. So the first thing is about environment. If you see somebody walking down the street, you see somebody falling down and they cry out in pain, they roll up their pant leg and they have a bandaged shin, for example, that's bleeding heavily, what would you do? Okay, so I've got one here. I think I'd at least help him up if I was alone and he didn't seem threatening. So that's important. Okay. Is this person threatening? If you're in a situation, especially in a more urban area, you would worry that this might be like a trap, right? That somebody is, gonna mug you or something. So continuing the answer, if I was in a group, I'd probably stand back and wait for somebody else to help. So this person says, I would ask if they need help, and if they do, call for help. I'd offer to help them up. Okay, so what are some things? So one thing that's already been said here, which is really important to consider, is if that person isn't threatening. And I think that, there is a gender difference here in terms of like if a woman needs help versus a man needs help, and who the helper is, man or woman. There's things to consider. So for example, if the man is down and a woman is helping, many times a woman has to think first, is this person threatening? Not to say that a man also doesn't have to say, is this person threatening? Because they can be mugged or harmed just as well as any other gender. So number one, is this person threatening, right? What is another factor that we have to consider? Maybe something like about you, not necessarily about like, are you going to help or not, but like, what is maybe a factor that you have to consider in this scenario about your situation? Okay, if they think I'm threatening, that's a really good point. So if the person has fallen down and they're injured and they are scared by you, right? So it could be that they feel threatened by you and you are going to help them, but maybe they're embarrassed or maybe they're scared of you. Absolutely, that's definitely a factor that could factor into the situation. And if you feel that they are scared of you, maybe you're going to be less likely to help them because you don't want to terrify them. If I do more harm than good, absolutely. If you're capable of helping, can I help them, or would a medical professional be better? Now, let's say you're a nurse and you're like, I know how to treat this, I can help this person. You're probably going to be more likely to help because you have the skill set to do so. You see situations where people do things like they'll fall or they get hit by a car or something like that, and they're on the ground. And we're told, EMT says, don't move them, right? And you're scared. You're like, I don't want to hurt them. I don't want to do more harm than good. I don't want to go move them and break their arm or something even worse. So these are things that you have to consider. If you don't feel like you have the skill set to help this person, then that might be less likely for you to help them. Okay, so this one said, if I'm able to help, for example, I'm CPR certified, so I'm more likely to stop than someone else with no knowledge would if someone seems to be a life-threatening injury. Absolutely, absolutely. So if you are, for example, and sometimes it's a matter of how good is your skill set. So maybe you're CPR certified, but you've never had to do it before, and you're nervous about it. But then somebody else comes and they're like, I'm a lifeguard and I do CPR all the time, and they jump on it. You're probably going to step back and let them because they have more expertise than you do. So these are all things to consider. The likelihood of you helping, what is that person, how are they responding? Are you the only person there? Are there other people around you? Is there somebody with more expertise around you? At the very, very least, you can call 911. And in some cases, some people are like, I don't want you to call 911 because they don't want an ambulance to come because then, they can't afford that. So there are definitely things to consider, but chances are the very least you could do is at least call for help. We also find that people who live in small towns tend to help more so than people who are in larger cities. So they've recreated this study so many times where they basically have two scenarios. They have a case where a person needs help, they fall down, and that person is in a very rural kind of area in a small town where there's not a lot of people around. And then this happens in large cities. And so what they find is that about half of the people do stop and help the man if he is in a small town, rural area. If this is, and you can actually Google this. There's a ton of replications of this where they'll have somebody fall down in the middle of a really busy city, let's say New York City. Only about 15% of people are likely to help them. They will literally walk over people who have fallen on the ground in larger cities. And we're going to talk about that just in a second about why that is. So we find that people in small towns are more likely to help when asked to find a lost child, when asked about directions, if they give them a lost letter and need help getting it back to somebody. These are all ways that we find people from small towns tend to help. And when you look at other countries, the pattern is the same. So in the United States, Canada, Israel, Australia, Turkey, Great Britain, Sudan, in the smaller towns, people tend to help more than those who are from more urban, busy cities. And so the question is why is it that people are more likely to help in smaller town settings than urban areas? So there's a couple of different ideas here. So one of them is the urban overload hypothesis. And that is that when you're in an environment that's very, very busy, we tend to get very overwhelmed by all of the sights and sounds and everything. And so because we're constantly being bombarded with stimulation, people tend to focus more inward, and they tend to focus on themselves. And so they might not notice somebody needs help, or they just tend to kind of direct their energy inward, and they tend to be less likely to help. One argument is that people who grow up in small towns might be more likely to internalize altruistic values. So the idea is that if this were the case, then people who grew up in small towns would be more likely to help, even if you were visiting a big city. So if you are from Appalachia, for example, and you go to New York City and you see somebody who needs help, you're going to be more likely to help than somebody who's from New York City. That's the idea here. Okay. Now, an alternative explanation is that it is just the surroundings themselves. And this is where that urban overload hypothesis comes in. And that is that when you have people who are in a calmer, less stimulating environment, they would be more likely to help. And what it turns out that there's a lot of research that supports this hypothesis. So if you are from a bigger city and you move to a smaller town, you become more likely to help. And the reverse is true as well. If you are from a small town and you go and you move to a bigger city, you become less likely to help. And the idea is that it's probably an environment that's not you yourself. It's not like you as a person has changed. It's the environment that has changed the likelihood of helping. And we also find too that in relation to population density, people who help are always going to help, right? And the idea is that when you're in a more densely packed city, that yeah, you have fewer people helping, but there are more people to choose from, if that makes sense. Whereas if you're in a small town, there's not as many people coming and going, and so you're just not going to have as many people who are able to help, just because of just the size, the density of the population. So these are all some factors that go into this explanation about why people who are in more rural areas tend to help more often than people who are in or more urban city areas. Another interesting factor, because remember we talked about urban versus rural. We're talking about residential mobility, and then we're going to talk about bystanders and number of bystanders. So when it comes to residential mobility, how often you move from one place to another is an important factor. The longer you live in one particular place, the more likely that you're going to engage in prosocial behaviors, because you're going to feel more connected to the community. You feel more interdependence with your neighbors, and you're going to have more of a concern about your own reputation to others in the community. So if you have been in the same community for 15, 20 years, and you know people, and you know their grandparents and their children and their grandchildren, and you feel very connected, you're going to be more likely to help, because everybody knows everybody knows everybody. So not only do you feel more connected, and you have that sort of reciprocity factor come back in, where you're like, if I help them, chances are they'll help me. There's a lot more connectedness there, and that's going to predict the likelihood of you being able to engage in more prosocial behaviors. Now, when you consider high residential mobility, where you are moving from place to place, you might not know your neighbors. You might not have been there long enough to really establish that connectedness. And so you're not going to be as likely to go help a person that you don't really know very well. So these are all things to consider when it comes to factors involved with helping. But there's a couple of videos associated with this chapter that I really want you to watch. One of those is about a waiting room, and I want you to take a look at that, because it's fascinating, and it's one of those things where you really don't believe it until you see it. You have somebody sitting in a waiting room, and there's smoke being pumped into the room, is it likely that you're going to call out for help? Is it likely that you're going to just assume that it's fine? How people react is going to predict your likelihood of reacting. We covered that also in like conformity. There's a video that's kind of associated with your likelihood of following and getting help, or actually just leaving. There's another interesting video about the Kitty Genovese case. And again, it's one of those things where you don't really believe it until you actually hear all the details. But it makes sense. So in Kitty Genovese's case, if you guys remember, we talked about this before, she was murdered in an alleyway, and people actually heard her murderer like harming her, and they didn't call 911 until much later. And so there were 38 witnesses to this murder who heard it going on. They knew that this woman needed help, but they did not call 911. And so Latine and Darley created an entire line of research just based on this case, because they were like, how is it that nobody called for help? And so the idea behind the bystander effect is essentially that when there's more people in the area who witness something and who are bystanders, the less likely you are going to call for help, because you assume everybody else is calling for help. And then everybody else assumes that everybody else is calling for help. And that leads to nobody calling for help. So the greater number of people who witness an event, the less likely anyone is actually going to help, because they just assume that either somebody else is helping or they don't want to get involved. When you look at the number of bystanders and how this factors in, there's a study that they did multiple times, and they replicated in a lot of different factors. There was this Latine and Darley study where they actually had a room where the person is sitting in there and they're on like a headset and they're communicating with somebody else. And they think that there are other people in other rooms, but it's actually just recordings, and they don't, the participant doesn't know this. And so what they are witnessing is another student witnessing through their audio is another student having a seizure. And so what it turns out that it's not actually happening, but the participant thinks it's happening. And so if the participant is the only person in the room, then they're going to get help. If the participant thinks that other people are listening in, then they're much less likely to actually help in the situation. So when you look at the statistic, most of the people, 85%, help within 1 minute, 60 seconds, when they think that they're the only ones who could get help. After 2.5 minutes, 100% of the people went and sought help, when they were the only people to observe this seizure. Now, when participants believed that there was at least one other person listening in, only 62% helped within the first minute. And then after there were more than 2 bystanders, it never reached 100% that a person is going to go and reach out for help. So even after 6 minutes, after the experiment was over, if you have 2 or more people who you think is observing an emergency, you are not always going to go get help. So these are definitely, as you increase the number of bystanders, the likelihood of a person helping goes way down because of the bystander effect. And we can actually see this here. So here, this is in the green. Okay, here, this is participants who believed that they were the only bystander listening to this person have a seizure and who needed immediate help. And this is the time. So this is the time elapsed, so within the first minute here, and this is the percentage of people who got help. So you can see that it reached 100% by the first 2 minutes. 100% of people do go get help. If you increase the number of bystanders, it doesn't reach 100%. Not everybody's going to go get help because they assume that somebody else is getting help. So if they believe that there is only one other person, you're going to be much more likely to help. And as you increase the number of participants, here there were 4 or more people, then you're going to be so much less likely to help, because you just assume, well, there's 5 of us here. Somebody probably went and got help. What factors into the decision of us going to get help in an emergency situation? So there's a lot of really interesting factors here. So number one, you have to notice that there's an emergency going on. If you're not paying attention, then you're never going to seek help, because you just don't know there's an emergency. So you might pass somebody who's fallen on the street and you didn't even realize that they needed help. If you're distracted, if you're in a hurry, then you're not going to help because you just didn't even see it happen, right? If you recognize that something happened and you don't interpret what happened as an emergency, then you're going to be a lot less likely to help. We call this pluralistic ignorance. So you interpret an event as no big deal. So let's say somebody's screaming. You just assume, oh, they're probably just playing around. It's not a big deal. This is what we refer to as pluralistic ignorance. We don't think there's an emergency. Why call 911 if you hear a scream or you hear gunshots and you're like, oh, somebody's probably shooting at a squirrel or skunk or something, or just target practice. That's probably not an emergency. You're not going to call for help because you don't recognize it as an emergency. If you notice the event and if you interpret it as an emergency, notice that as you move through these steps, you have to hit each one. You have to then assume responsibility. If you don't assume responsibility, which we refer to as diffusion of responsibility, you fail to assume responsibility. You diffuse it to someone else. You say, well, that's not my problem, or I don't want to be involved. Okay, it's not my responsibility. Then you're not going to help. If you recognize there's an event that happened, interpret it as an emergency, and then you assume some kind of responsibility. I should do something. No matter what it is, I should do something. Okay. Next, you've got to be able to understand if you have the right skill set to offer the right kind of assistance. So, do you have the right amount of knowledge? Do you have the right competence to help somebody? And so if you can't offer the appropriate amount of help, let's say somebody is choking and you don't know the Heimlich maneuver, if somebody is not breathing and you don't know CPR, then you don't have the appropriate knowledge to help that person. So you're not going to help because you don't know, you don't know how to help. Okay. If you recognize an event, notice an event, interpret it as an emergency, you've assumed responsibility, and now you're like, I know what to do. Now you have to decide, am I going to help? If you are scared that you know what to do, but you're too afraid to help because you don't want that person to like sue you, or you don't want to be embarrassed, then you're not going to help. If the cost of helping is too high, you're not going to help. If all of these things occur, you notice that there's an emergency, you interpret as an emergency, you assume the responsibility, you know what to do, and you've decided to help, that's when you help. So all of these things happen in a split second. This is not something that, this is a 5 steps of deciding if you're going to help or not. This all happens very, very quickly. In this particular situation, you see these people walking by, they've noticed something occurred. So if we look back at our steps here, they noticed the event. The question is are they going to get to step 2? What do you guys think? Do you think these people are going to get to step 2? Probably not. What do you think they're thinking? They look like they think he's homeless or drunk. They look disgusted. They definitely don't seem like they're empathetic toward this person, right? Now, this person could be having a seizure. This person could be drunk. We don't know. If these bystanders, because everybody here, these people aren't even noticing. These people haven't even gotten past step 1. They have not noticed that there is an emergency because they're all turned the other way. They don't see him. These people do see him, but chances are they're not going to move past step 2 here. They're not going to interpret this as an emergency. They look grossed out. They look disgusted. They are probably not going to help. We have to consider this isn't a case of that pluralistic ignorance of the guy's probably just drunk and they're going to go on with their life and that person's not going to get helped. So it's important to consider all of these factors and steps in the decision-making tree of, are you going to help or not? So how is it that we can use this to help yourself and to help others? What do you think that we can do as a society to reduce people from being victims of the bystander effect? Stop assuming someone else is going to help and do it yourself. Absolutely. I would say that's the second thing you can do. Number 1, and here it is, educate people about the bystander effect. If they know it exists, they might stop falling for it. 100%. Be aware of your surroundings. Be aware that the bystander effect occurs. Every one of you are educated now on the bystander effect. And now you know that the top thing that you can do is just call for help if it's ever in question. And don't assume that somebody else is going to get help. When you're in an emergency situation and you're trained properly, the first thing you learn is to identify a person and say, you're going to call for help, or I'm going to call for help. And that's something that's really important to know. And that is to try to reduce the effect of the bystander effect. There have been cases where students have been educated on the bystander effect and actually have saved people's lives because they figure, if I don't call, no one will call for help, and have actually saved lives because they learned it in a psychology class or they learned it in social psychology. So keep that in mind as you move along in your life, that you now know how to reduce this effect. Okay. So being aware of the barriers that help people help in emergencies, okay, can help you overcome those barriers. So for example, embarrassment. And we know that, yeah, we could get embarrassed if we call for help and the person doesn't really need help, but the cost of it really being an emergency situation and not calling for help might be greater than the embarrassment that you might feel. Knowing about the bystander effect, knowing that if you don't act, perhaps nobody else will, also very important to consider. This is a random acts of kindness video. If you are very touched by random acts of kindness, this might make you emotional. So I just want to kind of warn you about that. It's a very, it's a very uplifting video, but it is also very emotional. Just a final wrap up. This is a nice review. We talked about altruism. We talked about the factors that go into the likelihood of you helping. So that's individual, the person variables, situational variables, and how to increase prosocial behaviors, and then how to reduce things like the bystander effect.